South Bank Show, coming up next, only on Bravo.
Hello. William Burroughs' Naked Lunch became an instant landmark in contemporary American literature when it was eventually published in 1962. Burroughs' radical writing technique, his descriptions of explicit, often violent homosexual sex, his own addiction to heroin, and the use of drugs as part of the writing process led to the book being denounced as tasteless and devoid of any merit by a conservative literary establishment. However, when it successfully won its case against charges of pornography in America in the wake of Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, Naked Lunch came to mark the end of literary censorship in the United States. It's never been out of print since, and Burroughs has become a counterculture icon, adopted father of the Beat generation of writers and poets, and guru of the drug experience. For 7 years, Canadian horror director David Cronenberg and the British producer Jeremy Thomas discussed the almost impossible task of adapting Naked Lunch into a major motion picture. Finally, at the beginning of 1991, shooting began in a converted warehouse in Toronto. Cronenberg's own international reputation as a director determined to show the unshowable and speak the unspeakable has led him to attempt to film the unfilmable.
I give you my masterwork, the complete, all-American, de-anxietized man. Blast of trumpets. The man is carried in naked by 2 Negro bearers who dropped him on the platform with bestial, sneering brutality. The man wriggles. His flesh turns to viscid, transparent jelly that drifts away in green mist, unveiling a monster black centipede. Waves of unknown stench fill the room, searing the lungs, grabbing the stomach.
It tastes disgusting, even without the detailed but always callous homosexual scenes in
the bogus highbrow filth you attack is life-denying, spiritually as well as physically.
I can scarcely be accused of shirking
tasteless to an almost incredible.
But I do not wish to spend the rest of my life with my nose nailed to other people's lavatories.
Without the shocks and the stench, there would be nothing much left.
It is not possible to base great art on the sexual organs and on the alimentary tract.
It seeks to sicken, making the imagination
vomit. For
vomit.
heaven's sake, let us leave morals to the moralists and carry on with the job of learning to evaluate art as art.
Mr. Burroughs, when your book came out 3 decades ago, there was a lot of controversy. It went on trial for obscenity. Do either you or Mr. Cronenberg foresee having any kind of problem like that with the film version?
Well, I certainly don't foresee anything of the sort, having seen the script.
Now, I have to, having had maybe more direct contact with film censors, have to say that you really can't second guess the mind of a censor. But in terms of having the same impact as the book, no, I can't imagine reproducing that. I think a lot of what was completely unacceptable in '58, let's say, is only somewhat unacceptable now. Sometimes you're forced to think about it because studios and banks say, this is too extreme, too bizarre.
Or an actor comes to you and says, what does this mean?
Well, no, at least if an actor is talking to you, it's good, you know. I've had the experience where I couldn't even get on the phone with anybody.
Mr. Burroughs, are there any parts of the novel you regret not being able to see on film?
No, because, as I say, you have to limit your expectations very, very drastically. I mean, I wouldn't expect to see any more than a tiny fraction on film. Couldn't expect to see.
Is that all that's left? Just a tiny fraction?
Well, of course.
My God, what are you doing?
You're supposed to see this.
Well, now that I'm seeing it, what is it?
I'm shooting up your bug powder. You might like to try it yourself. Or you might not.
I ran out in the middle of a job. You gotta stop using the stuff, Joan. They ration it out like snake bite serum.
Just do what everybody else does. Cut it with baby laxative. Roaches will shit themselves to death.
It's the best job I ever had. If I run out again, I'm finished.
It's a very literary high. Very literary.
What do you mean it's a literary high?
It's a Kafka high. You feel like a bug. Well, I was sent the script by my agent, and my first response was kind of one of horror. I knew nothing about the background of the script. I knew nothing about the novel. So just, coming off the printed page, it does have rather, it's kind of weird and had shocking elements. And I remember throwing it some distance across the room.
Look, this movie deals with homosexuality, deals with drug addiction, deals with death and murder. Not like an entertainment, but like, a real sadness that happens in a man's life, that really happened. It deals with catharsis and betrayal and never knowing who you really are.
There may have even been a touch of outrage that this guy called David Cronenberg would have even thought of me for it. What in my history as an actress would have made him think of me for this thing.
There are two problems that you would have doing a literal filming of Naked Lunch. One is the scope of it, because it really is quite an epic. If it were to be on film, it would be the epic, the mother of all epics. It would cost, $400 or $500 million, I think, to film if you did it literally. And of course, it would be banned in every country in the world because there would be no culture that could withstand that film, I think, which is unfortunate because, of course, that makes it a very unappetizing proposition for any producer.
Well, I didn't have a fascination with it until a certain moment when David Cronenberg suggested that he wanted to make a film of The Naked Lunch. I'd read the book and was amazed by the book years before, and of course thought it was impossible to make a film of it, which, as a text, as a work, it's not possible. But then, when David discussed it with me, suddenly I saw it in a flash. Gosh, this is going to be an incredible film.
Joan. Joan.
Bill. Oh, Bill.
What is that? What are you writing?
I'm writing. All is lost. All is lost. It's all I've ever written.
Burroughs' main way of communicating with people was to write what he called routines to them, or even would speak them to them, which were like strange little stories taken to their absolute exaggerated ends, a bit like the episodes in the Marquis de Sade, let's say, or Apollinaire's pornographic stuff. And the most famous of these in Naked Lunch are things like the talking arsehole routine, in which a man trains his arsehole to talk, and then the arsehole eventually seals over his mouth and lives a life of its own. Naked Lunch itself was really a collection of routines which he sent to Allen Ginsberg. Burroughs moved to Tangier in 1953 after having a brief, rather disastrous affair with Ginsberg in New York. And from then, for the next 5 years, he sent these routines enclosed with letters to Ginsberg from Tangier to New York. And Ginsberg, who had acted as his agent on his previous book, Junkie, an autobiographical novel about his days as a junkie in New York in the early 40s, had very carefully kept them with the idea of turning them into a book.
This movie has, it's funny in the strange way that Burroughs is funny. But it also works on a level that Naked Lunch doesn't work on, the book, on a sort of very human, emotional level, which was Burroughs' choice not to do. The basic premise was that I moved back from the page in the typewriter to include the typewriter and then to include the man writing. In other words, I was using I was going to use some of Burroughs's life fictionalized in the filming of the novel, and in particular, I felt it was crucial to include the shooting death of his wife, Joan.
He had an arrangement to meet somebody in a bar to sell him a gun. And he and Joan went off to make this meeting. It was actually an apartment above a bar, above the Bounty Bar. And there Bill apparently had maybe 6 more drinks, so he was very, very drunk. And that was the occasion when Joan said, "Time for our William Tell act," and put the glass on her head. Although, as Bill later says, they'd never done this before, so, I mean, there was no William Tell act. And also, it was complete madness to shoot a glass off someone's head in a crowded room with glass flying everywhere. But he was very drunk, and he, although normally a very good shot, he missed and hit her between the eyes, and that was that.
I guess it's about time for our William Tell routine.
Joan doesn't appear in Naked Lunch, and there's no reference whatsoever in the actual book to her death. In that respect, that part of Cronenberg's film and many other sections come mainly from the Morgan biography of Burroughs rather than from Naked Lunch.
Jeremy Thomas and I and Burroughs had gone to Tangier in 1985, and we looked at all the places that he had been, and I still didn't write it. And the time wasn't right anyway. It was after Jeremy had his hit with The Last Emperor, and I had mine with The Fly. We thought, well, okay, now's the time. If we're ever going to do this very difficult project, we should start getting serious now. And when I went to do my little acting stint in Nightbreed and was in London for 2.5 months, it was actually on the plane, having bought my first laptop, that I started to write the screenplay. And to my surprise, it just was there, waiting for me. It just flowed, no problem. It was easy. As a book, you can kind of dip into it. You don't read it wall to wall. You dip into it. It's like the Bible, you know. It's a little bit here, a little bit there. Cross references, you find your favorite parts. Or perhaps the I Ching, you know. You look in it when you need it and you find something in there. I knew that I wanted it to have narrative cohesiveness. It wasn't just because it's going to be a movie that costs X million and therefore it has to have those things. It was my desire to do that. I wanted to do that. It meant that I was going to be forced to do something else, to fuse my own sensibility, my filmic sensibility, and every other level of sensibility with Burroughs, and create a third thing that neither he nor I would have done on our own. It's sort of like the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Borges has written a wonderful little critical essay on that poem, and saying that the English translator, Fitzgerald, I think, was no good as a translator. His translation of the Rubaiyat is very faulty, and Khayyam was actually not a very good poet. But somehow, over the span of 9 centuries, they combined to make this little gem of a poem, which would never have happened otherwise, and never did happen with either one of them separately. And so in a way, I'm hoping that's what, I feel that's what's happening here. It's like the two of us fusing in the telepod of The Fly, you know, and I'm probably The Fly. Burroughs will have to say is Seth Brundle, he's bigger. One of the things I said to him, for example, was, you know, I'm not gay, and so my sensibility when it comes to the sexuality of this film is going to be I don't know what. I mean, I'm not afraid of that, but on the other hand, it's not innately me, and I'm going to probably want women in the film, you know, because it's just what I'm going to have there, more than you have in Naked Lunch. I don't know what'll happen, and I got my blessings from the Pope. He said, fine, you go do it, you know. I mean, really, he's the last person to try and censor you.
There's cases where one picture is worth 3 pages of words, and then there are things you can do in words that you can't do in film at all. Well, take some of the great passages of English prose, like the end of The Great Gatsby, or The Dead in James Joyce, And also the sheltering sky, the real end of the sheltering sky is magnificent. But you can't do that with film. I didn't even see The Great Gatsby, but I heard it was a disaster. You know, when Hollywood gets their hands on a classic, it's a classic, see? Oh, my God.
Well, you know, The Naked Lunch was the problem. I mean, the very title of the book, Naked Lunch, well, that was the problem. And obviously, most of the people I was dealing with have not read the book. And a lot of them, I avoided them reading the screenplay until it was completed. All the various effects had been made, and there was something that could be understood a bit better. Maybe I flowered it up a bit, the descriptions. And then a lot of people loved it. You know, then suddenly the fear of Naked Lunch had gone, and it became a movie. The first screenplay was more extreme than what we're shooting now. It's just it's all down to a choice of what you choose to do, what sort of movies you choose to make, and what sort of material that you like, that appeals to you, with a mix of people that you like. You are, as an independent producer, you're sort of in charge of your own destiny. Those that didn't want to be involved in it said, you're completely mad. And those that liked it invested. I only lost one person. I only lost one of my regular group of people. Not bad.
Where did you put that Bradley the Buyer routine? Did you find it all?
Yeah, it's right on the sofa, right next to the Sans Rumpus Room riff. It's all right there.
I'm telling you, boys, I never saw those pages before. I truly do suspect some sort of colossal con.
Oh, someone's planted these pages in your room, right?
Somebody sent all those letters to me and signed them with your name, right? A well-orchestrated cabal could easily manage all of these simple things, children. When will you learn?
Well, they've done you a favor, Bill, because this stuff's going to get published under your name, and you'll have a career.
Yeah, you'll probably get into print before we will.
When Ginsberg went to Tangier in '57 to put the book into shape, he saw it as a regular book, of course, and wanted to impose narrative and everything on it. And although it doesn't really have that much sex in it, he did see considerable problems in trying to sell this to an American or British publisher. So it wasn't until '57, when he moved to Paris, that he took it to the Olympia Press, to Maurice Girodias.
Maurice Girodias sent someone over to say he wanted to publish it, have it ready for the printer in a few weeks. So we had about 500 pages of notes, some finished, some very rudimentary. So Brian Garson, Sinclair Bayliss, and I sat down and assembled this. And then it went to the printer as we finished. A chapter went to the printer. We said we'll figure out the order later, but when it came back from the printer, we took one look and said there's no necessity to make any changes except one. The scene of the detectives being killed, which was the beginning, originally went to the end. Otherwise, the way it came back arbitrarily from the printer was the way it was, the final order of the book. The result is closer to the facts of human perception, like the montage method in painting. Someone walks around the block and he puts on canvas. What has he seen? Well, he's seen a jumble of fragments. He's seen someone cut in two by a car. He's seen reflections in shop windows and passing faces, all sorts of things. And he comes and puts that on canvas. It's going to be a jumble of fragments. Actually, this came rather late to writing. As Brian said, writing is 50 years behind painting.
Brian Garson was an English painter living in the Beat Hotel in Paris, and in late '59, he was mounting some of his drawings in his room, and in slicing through the boards to cut out a mount, he noticed afterwards that he'd sliced through a number of layers of newspaper, and that if you peel away some of the layers, you can still read across. Bill immediately said, this was an amazing new discovery, a great breakthrough, and they began cutting up everything. From then on, he began work on this gigantic series of 3 cut-up novels, but there are no cut-ups in Naked Lunch. At the time the book was written, it had not been discovered as a technique.
It's particularly applicable to film. For flashbacks, flash forwards, a little flash here and there.
Who are you?
I'm Bill. Who are you?
I'm Tony. Where are you, Bill?
I'm in a 1920 movie, Tony. Where are you?
I'm in London.
Anthony Bolsh is a young English filmmaker who he met in Paris. Burroughs and Bolsh and Brian Geisen worked very closely together on a number of films in the early 60s. Then they decided to make an attempt at a full-scale film of Naked Lunch. Brian Geisen developed the script. They got as far as a full set of storyboards. Had the film ever been made, this would have been the truest possible version of Naked Lunch, partly because it comes from the same period. It really is only 3 or 4 years after the book itself came out, or it's 2 years after the book came out.
Well, no, there have been a number of people over the years who wanted to make the film, a number of sort of notable filmmakers who have wanted to make it over the years, but just haven't managed to crack the idea of how to do it.
I think it was the sort of Eisenhower-era repression, cultural repression anyway, that I felt, and of course being in Toronto, felt it even more than you might feel in, let's say, Chicago or New York, but it was everywhere, I think. That was one of the reasons, I think, that I was drawn to the underground, because it said forbidden things. It said that these things exist, sex exists, jazz exists, and then ultimately rock and roll exists. I found myself drawn to 2 writers in particular. One was William Burroughs, and the other one was Vladimir Nabokov. They are both beautiful stylists, each in his own way, and beautiful mimics. And they're both aliens. You know, Nabokov literally, because he's a Russian who got transplanted to America and had to write in a foreign language, namely English. And Burroughs, because he was born an alien and had to write in a foreign language, namely American. And I think that sort of outsiderness, even though it manifested itself in very different ways, drew me to it.
Cronenberg's screenplay, which is about the subtext of this book, or the impetus of the book, or the reason why this book happened, which was this man's sadness, this man's loss, this man's feeling that he never really belonged anywhere, that he was more or less shunned by his parents and his brother, by classic society as he knew it, by boarding school, by military, by straight-ahead Harvard, although he graduated from Harvard, more or less the acceptable culture as he knew it, gave him the boot.
Burroughs and I are not at all alike personally, and I think in terms of our backgrounds and our upbringings, extremely different. I think in a way it couldn't be more different, given that we were both sort of raised as middle-class children in North America, but other than that, we couldn't have been more different. But somehow there's a nervous system connection, and part of it has to do with our sense of the body and of disease and of transformation and of the possibilities of transformation, that kind of thing, and the scary part of that.
Right. Let's take another look. Yes. That's fantastic.
I've never had anybody say that about the inside of my body before.
Surely you've heard of inner beauty. I've often thought there should be beauty contests for the insides of bodies. You know, best spleen, most perfectly developed kidneys. Why don't we have standards of beauty for the entire human body? Inside and out.
I have a feeling you do.
Oh, yes, I think there are many points of overlapping interests. The far out, the mutants, the idea of mutants, of hybrids, many areas of coincidence.
Even the idea that evolutionary changes comes about through mutation, through chance mutation, which I think is where Charles Darwin ended up. Diseases are often involved in chance mutation, and so I think that that there's an approach there to even the evolutionary process, such as it is. So that's my take on disease, I think, at a certain point. Burroughs's is similar in that that there's a focus of intelligence on the question of disease, not just a sort of middle-class panic, medical alert reaction to disease.
Life and disease are inseparable. As soon as anything is alive, there's something ready to parasitize it or infect it in some way, which came first, the intestine or the tapeworm. So it's part of life, integral part of life, basic part of life.
His approach to insects is somewhat different from mine, and it figures prominently in the script. And I wanted to know, because he usually uses that as a negative feature, you know, if he says someone has blank insect eyes, you know, or an insect voice, that's usually meant to mean soulless, inhuman. I sometimes find some kind of attractive otherworldliness about insects. So we even have a different approach to that. You know, I asked him if he liked, were there any insects he liked? He likes butterflies, you know. But there is a similarity. The similarity is that we both wear our Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters medal proudly.
He it is, he and no other, who has reduced whole provinces of our fair land to a state bordering on the far side of idiocy. He it is who has filled great warehouses with row on row, tier on tier of helpless creatures who must have their every want attended. The drones, he calls them, with a pure, cynical leer of educated evil. Gentlemen, I say to you that the wanton murder of Clarence Cowie must not go unavenged. This foul crime shrieks like a wounded faggot, for justice at least. The centipede is rushing about in agitation. Man, that mother is hungry, screams one of the bears. I'm getting out of here, me.
Mr. Burroughs, how did your attitude to drugs evolve?
I wouldn't say that my attitude towards drugs evolved at all. It's pretty much fixed that the whole drug problem started when they made drugs illegal. Remember that all through the 19th century, which the conservatives always evoke as the good old days, you could buy opiates, cocaine, morphine, right across the counter, from sea to shining sea. Until 1914, when suddenly old ladies with arthritis, and frugal, hard-working Chinese, and old gentlemen with gout were illegal by act of Congress. Criminals by act of Congress. We didn't have enough criminals without creating them by act of Congress.
Certainly in terms of drugs, I had no experience. I had nothing like the experience that Burroughs did. And of course, until the 60s, like everybody else, I really had no drug experience. You know, that was for jazz musicians primarily. And yet, as a metaphor for control and addiction, it was very understandable to me.
Say, Bill, do you think you could rub some of this powder on my lips?
Yeah. Sure.
Well, now, as you might have expected, I have instructions for you from Control. It's about the little woman.
What?
The little woman. Your little woman. Your wife.
I think that the hallucinogenic drugs definitely make areas, psychic areas, available to the writer that can be very valuable. Once having been there, you can reach the area without drugs. That is, the hallucinogenic drugs make you more aware of your surroundings and also more aware of your inner areas, your visions, your psychic visions. The opiates being actually painkillers, that is, they blunt awareness of inner and outer perception, can to some extent deaden awareness depending on how much is used. But the hallucinogenic drugs are, I think, even useful. And I've seen lots of good to come from pot and LSD. I used a lot of cannabis when I was writing Naked Lunch in Tangiers. Cocaine just seems to make people garrulous and unintelligent. I don't like it myself. I hate anything that makes my hand shake.
Without drugs, Burroughs would not have produced the same book. There's no question of that. But I think without drugs, very little postmodern or very little modern literature would have existed, whether it's addictive drugs or soft drugs or alcohol. I think in Burroughs' case, he's made a scientific study of the taking of drugs and knows precisely what effects they will have and how to use them in order to produce these effects. So in his instance, he's used them very productively.
And his introduction to Naked Lunch is still the white paper. It's the Bible on drug addiction and how to 86 it, get rid of it. And then he goes into describing horror stories of beings called mugwumps sitting on bar stools and glycerin bars all over the world, you know, selling instantly addictive drugs that you can turn on to immediately and it turns you into raving madmen. Well, that's happening now in New York City, man. I mean, crack has turned suburban New York into lunacy already. But people reading this in 1961 said, wait a minute, you know, drugs are a thing of Times Square. They're a thing of the gutter. They're not me, they're not suburbia, they're not my house. Yeah, well, just about everybody in America's got somebody affected by drug addiction.
Did you bring back tomorrow's bug powder? Did you, Bill? Did you?
My God, Joan, you're acting like a full-fledged junkie.
And it's bug powder, for Christ's sake.
Well. I do have a little bit of a habit, yes, hon. You ought to at least give me a few marks for originality.
Since the 50s, there have been many movies about drugs, and most recently with the, Say No to Drugs campaign. I didn't want people to be thinking of Nancy Reagan when they watch this movie, let's put it that way. I knew that I wanted the drugs to be invented. Now, I know that's not a new thing either. That's been done for many years in science fiction and so on. But I felt by inventing my own drugs that had internal metaphorical connections attached to them rather than external social ones, I could stay away from discussing the social problems of what it's like to live with a junkie or whatever. I mean, some of that stuff is discussed in the film anyway, but I think it's pure because it's not about a particular drug or a particular social stratum that's connected with the drug, that kind of thing. So I knew I didn't want to do that, a movie about heroin and the methadone treatment or whatever. And I knew that I wanted it to be about writing.
Lee, wake up. This is no time to doze off like a freckled-faced boy on a fishing raft.
When you see the list of movies that have been made about writers, it's really quite extensive. Everybody from F. Scott Fitzgerald to Dashiell Hammett to Kafka. And the problems are always the same. That is to say, the act of writing is not very cinematically interesting. It's a guy, he maybe drinks, maybe has a hat, maybe he smokes, but basically it's a guy sitting there typing, typing, typing. It's an interior act and it's not innately cinematic. I think in order to really convey the experience of writing to someone who hasn't written, you have to be quite outrageous.
Okay, now, first sentence is, homosexuality is the best all-around cover an agent ever had. Ah, come on, Bill. Don't be such a pansy. Be forceful. Hurt me. I love it. That is a great sentence. These are words to live by, Bill.
there's certain requirements. If someone can't stand hours, years of solitude, sitting in a chair alone in a room, he should look for another trade, I think. Genet said about a French writer that il n'est pas le courage d'être écrivain. He doesn't have the courage to be a writer. Well, the courage, as Genet put it, of taking on the responsibility for your creations. That is, he saw his characters as literally his creations, for which he was responsible.
So in the film, I have made, metaphorically, things be created by my writer in the film that are physically present and that do influence him and tell him what to do. And it's, on one level, it's him telling himself what to do, and on another level, it's not. It really is creating something that will then take you through your life, and if you've created the wrong thing, it's going to take you to meet the wrong company.
It is so unusual to get sort of this sort of balance of the quality of filmmaking and sort of have that kind of literary history with a big effects film. I mean, you just don't get those two things together. Our Clark Nova typewriter that he relates to for about 3 or 4 different scenes is a character that we meet. You know, he has a relationship with him, and then he dies. I mean, we literally sort of go through this arc, and he has to be a real character. And the puppeteers all have to know the character and get involved in the character.
Leaving, I think, actually.
Okay, open them up.
There's some in my front box, but I can't get
Give me some dialogue. Excuse me. That's beautiful. Okay, close them up. Yep. And then open. All right. For each character, we have, let's say the Clark Nova, which is the main typewriter, we have 13 different puppets for that one character. There'll be a scene where the puppet will jump off a table, run across the floor, hit the door, bounce off, get put in a bag, and done with the scene. Well, that takes 6 different puppets. We need one that just runs along the floor. We need one that can look good when it dives. We need one that can talk as it's getting in the bag. And we just break it down like that.
We're taking your Clark Nova. I'll fit the bag.
No.
Anything that disturbs the status quo is dangerous in a totalitarian society. And if you're a serious writer, questioning, probing the status quo is what you do. You have to do. You're not worth anything if you're not. So there's an immediate, you're at odds immediately. And I mean something like the Salman Rushdie affair, which is the ultimate, I think, the ultimate example of writing being a personal, physical danger to you. But it's not a surprise. You think, my God, why haven't people done that before? You know, just put out a hit order on a writer to be carried out anywhere in the world, and you've immediately destroyed his life. I think Burroughs thinks that if the Ayatollah had gotten to read Naked Lunch in translation, he would be on the hit list too.
In Russia, even before the communists, the emphasis was always on political rather than sexual, but they're also very strict on sexual censorship in Russia at the present time. I think, in a sense, all censorship is then political. It has to do with control of thought. And also this strange schizophrenia in Western society, whereas there are some classes that can't talk without using all sorts of 4-letter words. You know, I walked down the street and saw a broad and went into the park and had sexual intercourse with her. that is the idea that these words are not in common use is absurd.
I can't read it. Is it erotic?
It's fairly erotic, kind of uncivilized.
More erotic. Filthier.
Filthier. Okay. Filthier. Getting really pretty good here. Just passing myself here.
Very good. Very, very dirty.
Telepathic sensitivity.
There's a lot of rubber, by rubber I mean special effects, which has the function of being metaphorical, which is something very difficult to do in cinema. Eisenstein tried it literally, you know, when the people rise up like a lion, cuts a shot of lion rising up. It doesn't work. I'm glad he did it and I don't have to. But it doesn't work. It's never been used effectively, never worked. But there are other ways, though, to deliver metaphorical conceits and parallels in film. You can do it verbally, you can do it in more subtle, less literal ways, and Eisenstein tried it. And I think in the case of Naked Lunch, I do it through the use of special effects, which are at some points very multisexual, and at other points very heterosexual, and another very homosexual.
Get those fingers curled.
Keep the head alive, Carol. Moving tilt up and down.
The mugwump, also known in the book as every man's drug dealer or control artist, as I'm sure Burroughs would want him referred to. They're not enemies, they're not villains, as it were. You know, they're just kind of affectations of the mind. So consequently, the humanity level or quotient has to be very high and believable.
From silent cinema onwards, special effects movies, Nosferatu, a special effects movie in Metropolis, Nosferatu. I mean, they're special effects movies, horror movies that have, which are sort of key works of cinema, and that's throughout cinema. There's been those movies which have been prepared to go step out a little bit from the norm, and then they can create a new wave and a new interest and an originality that is refreshing. And I think now we need would be great to have a sort of refreshing, charming horror film.
What's wrong with that one, you guys?
You a faggot?
Not by nature, no. I'm not. I wouldn't say faggot, no. However, circumstances have forced me to consider the possibility that...
I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. He specializes in sexual ambivalence.
Sexual ambulance, did you say? My God.
He's called Mugwump.
No point in feigning surprise. You knew we would be getting in touch with you. Why else would you come to a waterfront dive like this?
Why else?
I suggest Clock Nova Portable. It has mythic resonance.
Clock Nova? What, typewriter? Suggested for what?
For your report from Interzone, of course. Handwriting is not considered professional.
Some people were perhaps concerned about the homosexual elements in the script, but I don't think there's anything untrue that's depicted in the film. There's a lot of pain in it. And there are, fragments of love and sometimes desperate attempt to contact, the need for contact and the inability to contact.
Gracias.
There's a kind of a savagery in the script, anyway, that I'm sure Burroughs would never deny.
Goes around there to this. Hold this like that. Yeah.
But the film's certainly not trying to bash queers or, put down the homosexual world at all. One element of the script that it's really trying to enter that world, and it's quite a genuine and bold attempt to enter it.
They weren't the killer spiders.
No.
The sexuality in Naked Lunch is so extreme anyway, in terms of its imagery and violence often, that it would pose problems on film. One, for the practical problem of, can this film be distributed? It's one thing if you're making an underground film and you don't give a damn if 3 people see it or not. Another if it's $17 or $18 million, and you have to be realistic about what you're doing. Burroughs is constantly dealing with sexuality. Just scratch the surface of the gayness and you just have, you know, polymorphous perverseness there. And I think that's one of the reasons that Naked Lunch is so disturbing, because he's writing stuff that you would think would be gay pornography only and that heterosexuals might turn away from. But I think, in fact, heterosexuals find that very erotic and it disturbs them.
He was essentially bisexual until the mid-50s, inasmuch as he was living with Joan and indeed had a child by her. I think after her death, he unconsciously tried to distance himself from women, maybe partly to cover up the guilt of killing her or whatever. And towards the beginning of the 60s, particularly 1961, he had developed a very complicated idea in which women were agents for a trust of giant insects on another galaxy. And as such, we're entirely separate species and not even of this planet.
It pleases me to think that, and in fact it explains a lot of things, and it doesn't depress me, and it doesn't, I think it's very clarifying to think of that as a possibility. And I told him that there was a species of butterfly in which the male and female were so incredibly different, looked nothing like one another, that it took years for biologists to realize that they were in fact the same species and mated together. They kept looking for the female of one and the male of the other, could never find them, and it was always very mysterious. And it's because they were just different colors, different shapes, different sizes, everything.
When you bugs first approached me, one of your associates suggested that Joan was possibly not human. What did he mean by that?
Women aren't human, Bill. Or perhaps more precisely, they're different species from men, with different wills and different purposes on Earth. You know this instinctively, Bill, and it's your instincts that make you such a good operative.
I'm talking about Joan. If Joan Lee wasn't human, what was she?
Well, Joan was a special case. Joan was an elite core centipede.
The talking asshole, and I mean no disrespect here, is Burroughs himself, in the sense that it's the part of you that you don't want to listen to, that's saying things that are unspeakable, that are too basic, too true, too primordial, and too uncivilized and too tasteless to be listened to, but are there nonetheless. And the asshole that talks and tells you what its experience is, and tells you that it wants to be loved and that it wants to have the experiences that everybody else has, is in a sense, that's what I'm saying when I say people's reaction to some of the things that I do in my films and that Burroughs does in his writing is too middle class and too worried about taste and refinement and being civilized and nice, and therefore any truths that are involved in these disgusting things must not be listened to, must be discarded or disregarded. So in a sense, the mind asshole schism is maybe the head mouth versus the asshole. It's maybe more a Freudian schism, you know. I mean, the asshole is really then being the unconscious and the head is being the superego, more perhaps than it being a true mind-body schism. It's sort of a mind-mind split, I think. I don't know how it's going to be received politically, you know, in terms of gay politics and feminist politics and all the other kind of politics that there are. I have no idea, but I can't worry about it. Hopefully the work will remain, and I'm certain that Burroughs' work and Naked Lunch will absolutely remain.
Bill does maintain that since the death of Joan, he once told me that he thinks about her every day. There's never a day goes by without something reminds me of her, or the memory of her or her death surfaces. And he has written that his whole purpose as a writer is to fight the ugly spirit, which is constantly trying to dominate him and take over his life. And it was the ugly spirit which killed Joan. And Bill, after all, doesn't believe there's such a thing as a mistake. And he consequently has to deal with this fact and keep the ugly spirit at bay.
Mr. Burroughs, do you regret anything in your life?
I am very lucky if I can get through a day without something I did wrong, something I said wrong, gestured wrong. You talk of a lifetime? Good God. Practically everything.
I've got you under my skin. I've got you deep in the heart of me. So deep in my heart